Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Tonight we have some stories about reptilians for you, so enjoy, but don't forget to like, share and subscribe. A few years ago, my fiancé, who was my boyfriend at the time, asked his sister to invite me and my then boyfriend to her wedding in San Diego. We're from the city of New York. So at first we thought we'd just take a flight, but then I thought of something fun. I suggested that we leave a few weeks early and take a road trip instead. So by the time we got to California, we could rest and get ready for the ceremony by taking a few days off. I'd never been anywhere but the East Coast, so the idea of being able to see new places made me happy. From 30,000 feet up, you wouldn't be able to see much. After talking about it, we decided that if we did something like that, it would be easiest to rent a car and return it when we got there. Instead of taking our own car from there, we would just fly home instead, so we wouldn't have to drive all the way back. So when it was time to leave, we got our rental car, packed up our things, and did the standard check to make sure the stove, oven, and lights were off, and the house was locked. Other than that, most of the trip went as planned. We had some fun days, like when we stopped in Indianapolis and St. Louis and saw all the sights they had to offer, and some not so fun days, like when we got stuck in traffic or had to stay in a hotel that was a little more expensive than we could afford. No matter what, it was pretty cool to get to do things. I had never been able to do that before. On the whole, things went pretty well. Until we get to New Mexico. We tripped over something at night. I don't know what it was, but it was enough to cause one of our front tires to pop. After that, the road was so rough that the car was almost bouncing. We stopped and went to see what was wrong. The whole tire was so badly damaged that it was only held on by a thread. We went to look for a spare tire, and when we found out there wasn't one, my heart sank. We weren't getting good service or data where we were, so we were pretty much stuck. The good news was that the GPS in our car worked just fine because it used satellites instead of cell towers. The bad news was that it got its power from the car, so if we took it out, it wouldn't work. Then my boyfriend had an idea. He took out his phone, opened the Notes app, and copied the directions to the closest town. When we got there, it was about 5 miles away. We hoped to find a place to stay and have enough service to call the rental company and let them know about the car. From there, we would see what we could do. But before we did that, we wanted to wait a bit to see if we could flag down another car to speed things up. After about 15 minutes with no luck, we decided to walk the rest of the way. We were both very worried about leaving so many of our things in the car, but we had packed so much that we couldn't take it all with us. Even though we locked the car, it wasn't impossible for someone to break the windows and steal our things, like my dress and his suit, which were both pretty expensive. During the first few minutes of her trip, I can see the outline of a man running from a long way away. It was already late. But I wasn't really scared because I was with my fiancé. I thought it was just a late-night jogger, but I didn't understand why he chose to run across the land instead of on the street. Then he turned around, which gave me a different view of what was behind him. I tried to figure out what it was by squinting my eyes. I didn't notice how strange the shape of his face was until then. I had never seen anything so square on a person before. I had to ask my fiancé what it was because it was right next to us. I told him I didn't know, but my best guess was that it was someone who looked strange. I turned on the flashlight on my phone because the man seemed to be getting closer. I guessed because the man's eyes were shining back at us because of the light. Then I saw his whole body for the first time. Its body was a little bit crooked, and the bumps on its back stuck out like spikes. Its arms were much shorter than its legs, and it only seemed to have 4 fingers on each hand. At the end of each finger was a long, sharp black nail. It had a face that looked like a person's, but it was so strangely shaped that it was almost uncanny. It had snake-like eyes, and I quickly figured out that the thing that was trailing behind it was actually its tail. It didn't have skin. In fact, it looked like it had dark green scales from head to toe. This animal hissed at us, showing us its long, snake-like tongue that had been hidden by its mouth. My fiancé and I ran away, yelling for help and screaming, and as we did, something stuck itself behind us and continued to hiss and snarl down below. I can make out a small town's lights. We were too high up on the cliff, though. We were on to find our way down safely. Instead, We had to keep going down the winding road into the city, which could take a long time. Then I came up with an idea. I stopped what I was doing and picked up a few rocks nearby. He asked me what I was up to. When I turned around, I saw one of the creatures. The first one missed, but the second one hit it right in the head. It cried out in pain and stopped shaking its head for a moment. We kept running, but the monster seemed to be getting even more angry. It started moving faster, but neither we nor it were very fast, and I didn't know if we had enough stamina to outrun whatever it was. When we were almost at the bottom of the cliff, a car drove by loudly honking its horn because we were too close for the driver to like. The animal made a loud noise and ran off to the side. We keep moving forward though. Even though it didn't seem to be following us anymore, we didn't want to take any chances. We finally stopped to catch our breath as we got close to the town's entrance. Before doing anything else, we went to a nearby McDonald's and got some water. Then we sat down in one of the booths and tried to figure out what had just happened. My fiancé tried to cheer me up by reminding me that we did get to where we were going in the end. We tried calling the rental company, but all we heard was a recording saying that their offices were closed for the night and that we should try again in the morning. We didn't know what else to do, so we didn't know what to do. We walked to a small hotel and rented a room there. We were tired, and despite what had just happened, it was easy for us to fall asleep. We were glad we had each other. When we called the rental company first thing in the morning, they said they would send a tow truck to fix the car, and we could pick it up in town later that day. We left the hotel and went back to McD's for breakfast after we checked out. My fiancé says that the only thing he could find that looked like what he saw was a chupacabra. But even then, some pictures made it look like a dog or a coyote, not like a reptile. So we had a hard time figuring out what the hell it was. No matter what, I was just glad it was no longer after us. We walked around town all day while we waited to hear that our car was fixed, but there wasn't much to see. When we finally got the call, we got into our car and checked to make sure everything was still there, when everything seemed fine. We stopped at a gas station to get gas and a few snacks. When we were ready to start driving again, we both laughed a little when we realized we had to go back to the same place. We were chased down so that we could get back on track and head to San Diego. When we got back to the road, I thought I saw light-webbed footprints in the sandier parts of the ground, but I just shook my head and put my feet up on the dashboard to relax. The rest of our trip is fine, and despite what happened, we were able to make the most of it. By the time the wedding came around, we had told the story to many different groups of people over and over again. As expected, a lot of people didn't take it too seriously, and to be fair, we didn't either. Pretending it was just something silly helped us deal with it. I guess a lot of people brought up the chupacabra, like my fiancé did, and some joked that someone from the town was trying to scare tourists away, like in Scooby-Doo. We eventually flew back to New York, and it didn't come up again. After all, we had other things to do, like our jobs and social gatherings. Still, it wasn't long before my fiancé proposed to me, and I think that event and his sister's wedding played a big part in his decision. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but to me it meant that life can throw all kinds of crazy things at you, and if you can handle such an intense experience with someone you love and make it through okay, then the two of you can take on anything. Bills would be nothing compared to what we had to deal with. Anyway, since then, I haven't been back to the Southwest, and I don't really plan to. I'm not really afraid of running into that reptile man again, since it happened in rural New Mexico, and I don't really have a reason to go back there. Still, it makes me wonder what other kinds of creatures are out there waiting for people who don't know they're there to stumble upon them. Even where I live, who knows? No matter what, I'm just glad I live in a place where there aren't many reptiles or reptile men. When I was young, every day after school, I would go stay with my aunt. She is my aunt, and she lives in a lovely farmhouse on the edge of my town. She grew up in the country, so she is a real country woman. She takes care of hens and ducks. She even has a few cows here and there, though they're just dairy cows now. She gets her own water from the rain and is the perfect example of a self-reliant woman, or what some people call a prepper, during one time. But when I was a kid, I was probably 8 or 9, I saw something terrible and deadly at her house. It happened in the garden, which is big and full of different kinds of flowers. The smells of these flowers are strong enough to make anyone fall in love with them. This is where the event took place, and it was springtime. So the whole place has a beauty that comes from somewhere else. My aunt took great care of her garden, which is why it looks so nice. I was a rowdy 9-year-old boy, so I spent most of my day kicking balls and running around the garden with my younger brothers and sisters. I'm a very logical person, and I know this might sound crazy. I found your channel while watching funny videos on YouTube in the evenings. I thought, man, I wonder if this person would be interested at all, and what I went through as a child. So I said I was about 8 or 9 years old. Well, my aunt had a lot of chickens in the backyard, and she asked me to bring her one so she could kill it for dinner. I know this isn't a very vegan or animal-friendly story, but I can't make it sound better. I wore a red t-shirt, yellow shorts, and blue boots. A little rain fell too, so I put on a yellow raincoat before I grabbed the chicken. My aunt asked me to go to her pond and feed the ducks there. Near the bottom of the garden was a pond that was a great place to sit and relax. In those days, my dad was a pretty bad alcoholic. When he got home, he would often trash the house, yell at my mum, start fistfights in front of me, throw furniture, and almost choke her to death. It was very scary and harmful to me, especially as a child. I spent a lot of time at my aunt's because of this. I felt safe there, and the calmest place for me was around her pond, where I could watch the little ducks swim around quickly. On this day, though, as I stood there and threw in little pieces of squished bread, I did not feel at peace. There was a big cloud in the sky, and it looked like it was about to rain. Soon I started to worry a little, because the pond is only about 100 yards from my aunt's house, and I knew she would be mad if I got wet. I kept standing there and watching the ducks. Then I saw something strange and scary. There was a little bit of blood in the corner of the pond, as if one of the ducks had been bleeding. I looked in the pond to see if there was anything else I could see. But no, I didn't. At that moment, I saw in the corner of the pond that one of the beautiful, delicate ducks had blood spots all over its body. I felt sick to my stomach and wondered what was going on. Had it been injured? Someone did this, right? What was happening? I tried to figure out what was going on, but I just kept staring. I tried to pet the duck, but it had a bit of blood on its back, so it swam away as if it didn't want to be touched. I tried to say, "Baby sounds are okay, little guy," in a whisper. I decided I should probably go in and tell my aunt, and as I stood up, I threw in the rest of the bread. I hoped that at least the ducks would be fed. As soon as I stood up, I felt like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and grew into huge spikes. Even now, when I think about this, my hand is shaking. A huge reptile, at least 15 feet long, was sitting on my aunt's flowers by the edge of the pond. It had green, scaly skin and big, spiky feet that looked like they had teeth on them. It was completely strange and horrifying to see. I tried to yell, but nothing came out of my mouth. I was shocked by the terrible thing in front of me. It looked mean and scary, and I knew right away that it was the cause of the blood on the ducks in the pond. Who was this animal? I wondered if my aunt knew anything about it. Certainly not. She would never take care of such a thing. The creature turned its red, slit-like eyes toward me and looked menacing, as if it could stick its tongue out and eat me right there. I screamed as loud as I could, and then I ran back to my aunt. I didn't turn around until I was inside and the thing was gone. The only thing I can think is that it went back to the swamp behind my aunt's pond. She put her hand on my head and could feel the cold sweat running down my forehead. She knew I was telling the truth. It was the strangest thing, but she made me some hot tea and let me sleep with her that night. In the fall of that year, my aunt suddenly died of a heart attack. At the time, she was very upset because most of her farm animals were getting sick and dying or just going away. Environmental health officers and vets said it was because of the pollution in the air, but I thought this animal had something to do with it. No matter what it was horrible. It didn't look like an alligator. Instead, it looked more like a giant lizard that had been mutated. I don't know how to describe it because I've never seen such a strange-looking animal. It was there at first, but after I ran away, it was no longer there. I almost wonder if it was going to sneak up on me and eat me whole, because it was right where I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't turned to look at it. It could have come right up on me if I hadn't seen it. Anyway, like I said, my aunt had a heart attack later that year, But it was again. I think she was going through a lot of stress because she was losing a lot of her livestock and her favourite cows, and they couldn't find any sign of them anywhere, not even a body. So again, I don't know how to sum it up, but I do know that I'm not crazy and that this did happen to me. What I saw was real, I know that. In the early 2000s, when I was in college, I spent a lot of time partying. I'm 39 years old, married, and have 2 kids. I couldn't be happier with my life. Back then, I know I drank too much. Hey, I might have smoked a little pot here and there, but I was mostly a good kid. I grew up in the middle of the country, so I always knew I wanted to make my mum and dad proud. So I knew how to avoid hanging out with the wrong people. Well, I tried, but one night when I was in my dorm, this guy was knocking on people's doors. I heard him mumbling, but I didn't understand what he was saying. At the time, I was doing an assignment on my desktop and hoped he wouldn't knock on mine. But he did, of course. Sky's hair was black, her eyes were dark, and she wore a long leather jacket. He had a blank look on his face and shady eyes. But he put out his arm and showed me something. He was high on something. He asked me if I wanted to buy it, but I said no, of course. At the time, the only drug I'd ever try was weed, and even that made me feel very sleepy. I closed the door right in the guy's face. I had the weirdest feeling. He got mad at me. Just by the way he looked at me, I felt like he could have killed me right there and then and not cared. I guess that if you want to be a drug dealer, you have to put aside your feelings and just think about making money. After he left, I went into the kitchen with my roommate to talk about it. He didn't know who let this person into our dorm. It was very dangerous and very risky. I mean, he could have drugged and raped a weak girl if he had found one. We were very worried, but since we had already had a problem, we didn't want to tell the campus authorities. After getting drunk, I messed up our house. The campus officials told us that if we caused any more trouble, they would have to kick us out. At the age of 19, I couldn't think of anything worse than having to move back in with my parents. Now that I was on my own, I worked hard and enjoyed a cold beer in the evening. I could wake up whenever I wanted and eat whatever I wanted. My friend and I chose to keep quiet. We'd just keep an eye out for anything else that seemed strange. We'd also tell the other people in the hallway to stay alert and not get too drunk until we knew more about the sky and who or what it was that was after us. I went to bed that night around 11 p.m. I was tired, and the next day I had a big test. Around 2:00 am, I woke up because I heard shouting outside my window. When I got up and put my feet on the cold floor, I groaned and pulled back the curtain to see what was going on. The same guy from earlier was standing right outside my room, about 10 yards away. He was talking to a girl who sat on the sidewalk with her face in her hands and looked like she was drunk. I felt sick. I knew I needed to take action. Even though I was only wearing boxers and a housecoat, I put on my housecoat and the first pair of shoes I could find. I knew I didn't have time to dress. This guy was clearly in danger, and if she took drugs, he might die. This guy was bad, and I wanted to tell him what I thought of him. I went outside to talk to him, but when I turned the corner where my bedroom faces, I couldn't see anyone. Even the girl wasn't there. I was scared. I looked in every direction. At that very moment, my eyes got as big as footballs. A big animal that looked like a reptile was staring at me. It was standing right where the girl had been a few minutes before. This thing looks like the perfect combination of a human and a lizard. This thing was very big and stood about 10 feet tall. It had slimy, scaly green skin, a bald head and huge yellow eyes. I got sick and felt like I'd been shot right in the stomach. I felt like I was going to pass out because my shoulders got heavy and my breathing slowed down. The creature, which I still think of as a demon to this day, kept staring at me after I had a massive stroke. I raised my hands as if I were giving up, just in case it came at me. I couldn't take in what I was seeing, but I knew in the back of my mind that it wasn't a dream. The wind was blowing, and I was aware of how vulnerable I was. My mind raced. What was going on? Was it a joke? Or I might have taken ecstasy without even knowing it. All of this was a dream, and nothing made sense, but I felt fine on the inside. I did not feel like I was high on drugs. I knew what I was seeing was real, because it was too cruel and animalistic to be another person in a costume. The creature made a sound like it was laughing at me, and then, without breaking eye contact, It slowly moved back into the bushes until it was gone. Well, I say they were bushes, but they were more like hedges because they surrounded this thing as it stood back into them. I went back inside and made a cup of hot coffee for myself. When I picked up the phone to call the police, I changed my mind. I was afraid I would look crazy. And I knew that if they did a drug test, they might find traces of marijuana or alcohol, and I didn't want to get a bad name or record. I had a bright and promising future ahead of me, and I didn't want that to be ruined at the time. I'm not really sure what this was. Was it a monster or something else? I wasn't sure, and it wasn't until the past few years that I really started looking into it. I could say that I think I may have met some kind of reptilian being, but I don't know for sure. I'm telling you this story so that you can give me the answers I'm looking for. I've lived in a rural part of Mississippi for the past 6 years, and it's pretty common to hear different animal sounds. Still, I can't tell what animal is making the sound I've been hearing lately. It's not unusual to hear coyotes howling like that. My partner thinks this was a coyote, but let's be honest, a coyote doesn't sound like a dinosaur yelling. Only at night do I hear the sound, but it makes me feel like I live in Jurassic Park. If you've ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, you know that when a dinosaur roars or makes a sound, it has this reptilian sound to it, even though the T-Rex sound, for example, is made up of a few different tones. It still sounds like it's coming from a large reptile or a dinosaur. I'm telling you this and putting it in my email because that's the only way I can accurately describe and explain how it sounds. It doesn't sound like a coyote, and my partner seems to want to argue with me. I don't know if he's scared or what's going on, but it doesn't sound right and is unlike anything I've ever heard. We live near a pretty big area of swampland, so that's already a point against us. I've heard all kinds of weird, scary stories about people getting lost in swamps and all the monsters, quote-unquote monsters, that live in swamps. Then I begin to hear this at night. I don't think that monsters are always real. If I'm being honest, I think I'm probably just hearing an animal I don't know. Still, from a scientific point of view, I've never heard an animal sound this loud or like this one. I'm not sure how much you know about big reptiles that live in swamps, but as I type this to you, it almost sounds like a hiss. I'm trying to think of an animal that I can tell you about. The most sense would be to do that. If you've ever heard a Komodo dragon, for example, they have this deep, angry groan hissing roar that isn't quite what I'm hearing. But think about if that was louder and had more of a roaring, guttural sound to it. Now you're getting closer to what I'm hearing again. A reptile sounds like a reptile, and there's no mistaking that. I'm sorry if this email is too long. It just scares me a lot these days. So I thought I'd reach out to a few big YouTubers, because I'm sure you learn a lot from all the stories people send you, and are able to explain some things that might be out there, or that people didn't know about a few years ago. Since we moved up here, we've made some new friends who told us they've seen Bigfoot in the same area. Now, I'm not a believer in Bigfoot by any means, but the way they described their encounters and sightings is scary. I guess there are a lot of Bigfoots out here, but I didn't know that before I moved here. I thought to myself that the noises I hear at night in the swamps could be a Bigfoot, but based on what I've heard, and what I know about Bigfoot in general, they don't sound like reptiles. Perhaps they do. I hope you can answer me and talk back. Maybe it's a type of animal that has never been seen before and only lives in the swamplands of the Mississippi. I've been holding on to this experience for a long time and haven't told anyone about it because I'm afraid I'll be laughed at and called crazy, but maybe it's time for me to finally tell the world about it. After hearing all of the stories that people have told you, it has really pushed me to step up and talk about what happened to me in Columbus, Ohio in the late summer of 1979. Mississippi, your reptilian video series is exactly what I've been wanting to talk about for the past 6 months. I had no idea that anyone else had seen a creature like I had. I've heard people talk about Bigfoot and even heard of something called a Mothman, but I never would have thought that other people have seen large reptilian creatures that looked like people just like I did. I thought I was crazy because I thought I was the only one who didn't believe in conspiracies or want to go down that rabbit hole. But the more I hear some of these stories, the more real it all seems, and the more it takes me back to that night. I could tell you that it was July 10, 1979, and it was getting dark. I lived with a group of people in a small house, a few buddies. I'd only been there for a few months, and I'm from a small town in Colorado by nature. So, a few of my friends moved out here to start a small business, and they really wanted me to join their team and work in their department. At the time, I didn't have a job, so I thought it would have been a great idea to share a room with some friends who worked at the same place. We could have fun together and get work done at the same time. What more could you want in life when you're only 22? Now, you have to understand that where I lived at the time wasn't as developed as it is now, with stores and businesses everywhere. Commercial real estate has grown a lot in almost every area. Back then, this was about as rural as it gets, with only a few plots of land here and there and a few scattered houses. There were mostly empty fields and thick woods all around. Sure as hell was a person. We had about a 25-minute drive to work, which we liked because it meant we could party and be as loud as we wanted without having to worry about angry neighbours calling the police on it. In fact, that's one of the reasons we chose to move in together and rent this house. If you look out the front door, it goes all the way to the front road. After that, it goes down a small slope to a thick, grassy field that goes on for acres and acres into more and more dense woods. You can call it an empty meadow, because the only things there are probably some marshland and really tall grass. There was no building, and the closest house is probably a half-mile down the road in either direction. Again, great for young people in their early 20s who want to party but don't want to bother anyone on purpose. At that age, I drank like a pirate, but at the time of the sighting, I was completely sober, and that's something I really want to focus on. A few of my roommates were out doing something, so I was the only one home at the time. I don't remember what they were doing, but when they weren't working, they were probably out chasing girls like they always did. I was usually the one who didn't say much. I was outside smoking a cigarette when I saw a huge lizard come out of the tall grass in the field on the other side of the house from where I was standing. I looked at it hard for a few seconds, trying to figure out what it was. Then it turned its head, and the rest of its body followed. It started to slowly walk towards the wood line, which was probably a few hundred yards away. I saw this thing walk all the way to the edge of the woods, where it went into the woods and disappeared. This thing looked like it was a cross between a Komodo dragon and a person. It looked dark and scaly, and its arms were long. It did have a tail, but it was hard to see because the grass was so tall. I was smoking a cigarette outside when I saw a lizard man. I almost dropped my cigarette and thought to myself, I just saw a lizard man. I didn't really have anything in mind. I was just staring off into the distance and thinking about my day when this thing came out of the tall grass. But it was tall. That grass is at least 3 feet tall, but it only reached about mid-thigh on this thing. That meant it was probably between 7-8 feet tall and had a huge head like a snake. I don't know if it saw me or if it didn't see me and chose to ignore me, but it never looked over at me, and I wasn't hidden by trees or bushes. I was out where anyone could see me, this skinny, small little guy. We don't have any trees on the house or in the yard, so I was sticking out if it would have looked over. I don't know if it was hunting or doing something else, but it was there before I came out with a cigarette and sat down in the grass. I was out there for about 5-7 minutes before I saw this thing stand up and walk away. It walked just like a person does. It moved very smoothly and took long steps. It was very muscular, and it didn't look like there was even an ounce of fat on it. By the size of its muscles, you could tell it was strong. It never made a sound, and I never smelled anything. After it went into the trees, I did what I said and dropped my cigarette and ran inside. Even though what I saw was amazing, it scared me a lot. I didn't know that there were lizards out here that walked on their hind legs. Like I said, I grew up in a small town in Colorado, so this was very different from what I was used to. I didn't tell any of my friends when they got home that night, and I kept this experience to myself for a long time. But I do sometimes think about it. All the reptilian stories you've posted in the last few months really took me back to that time, so I thought it was time for me to tell my own. Now, I know that many of the stories you tell are about very different animals, most of which act very mean and hostile. Well, I don't think I saw any of the things you said you saw, but you can be sure that it was a humanoid-looking reptile that walked upright. It was huge and very tall. After that, I never saw it again, because I moved back to Colorado the next year. Anyway, thanks for letting me tell you about what I did. So, my uncle is now 79 years old, and sadly, he is on his deathbed and doesn't have long left to live. He is doing what most people do on their deathbed. He is admitting to all the bad things he has done in his life and trying to make up for as many of them as he can. He knows very well that he doesn't have much time left. So he told us about some of his crazy life experiences, which were both sad and funny at the same time. These times are both sad and happy, but for about 9 years he told my mother and me something that was very scary. My uncle had a lot to do with the mafia. I don't know if the mafia or gang he was in was connected to the Italian mafia, the Russian mafia, etc. But I do know that they were bad people. He told me that he had killed more than 20 people for drugs, money, sex, or to get money from the mafia. The list keeps growing. My uncle is definitely not proud of it, and telling my mother and me about it was the first time he's ever said it out loud. He got off track and told us about a strange thing that happened to him. I'm still not sure what to think about it. It's scary, but I know my uncle well enough to recognize the look in his eyes as he tells the story. This is the truth. I saw how he really felt as he told us about this. Even though the story I'm going to tell you is his story, whatever it was scared him to death. It makes me feel bad, but bear with me while I tell you about this event, which happened in 1972. My dad and his mob partner just shot this guy in the head because he ripped them off on a drug deal. I think that the whole thing had to do with cocaine, and a lot of it. When asked about it, I think he told them, "Go for yourself, to put it nicely. Since they are the mafia, they won't put up with that." So, as they like to say, they took care of business. My uncle and his partner got rid of his body by taking it out to the middle of the swamp, where they dumped it and buried it. This was the only way they knew how to do it at the time. Let the alligators and whatever other bugs are out there take care of the rest. I'll never forget how my uncle looked us in the eyes and told us how many times we had done this to get rid of bodies and never been caught. I've lost track of how many there are. Anyway, getting back to the story, my uncle and his partner were out in the middle of the night in northern Louisiana, somewhere in the middle of a swamp. He couldn't remember exactly where because I don't think he knew exactly where. I think they just stopped somewhere, pulled the body out of the car, and used shovels to walk into the swamp a bit. They were going to just throw the body away, but they decided it would be better to dig at least a shallow grave to hide any signs. This lantern belongs to my uncle's business partner, and my uncle is the one digging the shallow grave. They both started to hear what he said sounded like a jaguar. They both look at each other and nod their heads to keep digging and not pay attention to the sound. My uncle keeps digging, and he says, "I had just pushed the shovel into the soft ground, pressed it in with my foot, and heard my partner scream bloody murder. When I looked over, I saw a lizard that was bigger than a man running toward him. It swiped its claws at him, cutting him open, and the lantern he was carrying and his guts both fell to the ground at the same time." My uncle had to stop here because he was getting a little too emotional. At this point, it became clear that he was having a hard time telling us the story. Then, without even stopping to think, he threw the shovel down and ran as fast as he could back to the car while turning around and firing a couple of shots from this thing. Even if it was following him, he wasn't sure. He was just completely shocked and scared. He made it back to his car and drove away. He was more worried about his partner's body, which was in a trash bag and sitting outside with a shovel if anyone caught their DNA, was everywhere and everywhere. All of this, plus the fact that he had just met some kind of huge swamp lizard that killed his partner in one swift swipe, made him very scared. What was he going to say about the fact that his partner had vanished? He told us that the mafia thought he had something to do with the death of his partner, so they tortured him for 4 days straight. He never really told the story he told us about how a swamp lizard came out and ate his partner's insides. They wouldn't have believed anything he said and would have probably killed him. In fact, my uncle is happy and grateful to be alive. He says that he is very surprised that they didn't kill him, but that he understands that they wanted to teach him a lesson instead. I asked him to tell me more about what he saw, the thing that killed his partner, but all he kept saying was that it looked like a big lizard with big teeth and long claws, and that it ran on 2 legs like a person, but was shorter than him and his partner, who were both about average height at 5 feet 10 inches, 5 feet 5 inches and 11 inches. And the fact that the swamp was dark and the lantern was the only real light he had. It's hard for me to know how much he really saw, but it must have been bad for a cold-blooded man like him to be so upset by it. A man who wouldn't think twice about killing you if you got in the way of him and his mafia family, just in case she didn't notice the first time this happened in northern Louisiana. Sometime early in the morning. I was told that my uncle then went off on a different story, but I could tell that it was hard for him to tell us again. Since hearing my uncle's story, I've been able to watch a few of your Repitilian Encounters on your channel. It was clear that it was a very scary thing. Just to check and see if there are any similarities between his story and the ones you've posted. Even though I don't know what it means, the fact that other people besides my uncle have seen reptiles in the swamps is pretty creepy. I've always known that swamps are dangerous places where alligators live, but if you had told me that man-sized carnivorous lizards lived there, I would have been surprised. Well, that's something completely different on its own. My sighting happens in the southwest corner of Tennessee. This is at the Cross Creeks National Wildlife Refuge, which is right next to the Cumberland River and not too far from the small town of Dover East. I was taking the 49 home late one night. Here is where I saw what I'd like to call the man iguana from hell. The 49 is mostly a 2-lane highway that goes in a straight line through the wetlands. There isn't much to see that is particularly interesting, except for what I saw, which was unusual, but not in a good way. This 2-lane highway goes through wetlands with thick forests on both sides. The Cumberland River is also right next to the highway. Keep an eye out for deer and other animals that come to the river at night, like nocturnal animals. Even though I wasn't born in Tennessee, I've lived here for a long enough time to feel pretty safe driving here, especially at night. Nearing midnight, it was getting pretty dark outside, and there were no other cars on the road. Someone I called the Iguana Man from Hell comes out of the woods to my left. I call it that because every part of this thing looks just like that. Everything about this thing was scary. This thing comes out of the woods to my left, crosses the road in front of me, and heads north down towards the river. This thing was so big that an adult dude's dead body was hanging from its mouth. This thing is probably about 9 feet tall. And if I had to guess, I'd say this thing was easily 5 feet tall. It was a whole king lizard. It's like you crossed Conan the Barbarian with an iguana that looks like a devil. The head looked like a person and an iguana had a baby, which is where I got the name. This thing looked really bad. Its face looked like that of a fierce top predator. The whole thing looked like it didn't belong, and it was big enough and strong enough to carry a whole dead deer in its mouth. Exactly nothing. This thing just walks right out of the woods, across the road and into the river. Because this thing walked right in front of my car, my headlights were able to show it in all its glory. But I didn't care about it. Didn't even look at me. I'm sure it didn't think I was a threat, so I guess it didn't even notice me. I was scared and shocked at the same time by what I was seeing. This thing looked like a failed science experiment that had been thrown into the swamps. I thought there had never been a lizard man before, so it took me a while to realize that I had just seen one. After that, I couldn't figure out who to tell about it. Who's going to believe me? It's not as easy as just seeing a Bigfoot. People there won't even believe you if you say you've seen something other than a Bigfoot. They were the first people I told about what happened, and even they didn't seem to believe me. I went through a time when I tried to convince myself that I had finished it all. But I came to my senses in the end and saw that this is the truth. Even though it scared me to death, this thing was real and it breathed. I just recently learned to be too careful when I drive, especially at night. I do tell people my stories sometimes, but most of them don't believe me, which is fine. I feel like this is one of those times when you tell me something and I don't know what to do with it. So the most important thing is to be careful and know that there are things out there that we don't fully understand. The lesson of my story is that you should always be as alert as possible and aware of your surroundings. You probably don't find it surprising that you've heard stories about dinosaurs still being alive. Missionaries who have traveled deep into the Amazon rainforest have seen things that many forgotten tribes have seen, like real, breathing sauropods, though this is very rare. These aren't the only times people have seen big reptiles, even though the details of these sightings may be as hard to find as dinosaurs themselves. People have also seen things in the deserts of Arizona that many people think are some kind of velociraptor, not like the ones in Jurassic Park, but ones that look more like birds. There is at least some evidence that these things do exist. Still, the real point of this message is to tell you about the different things that happen near Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Now, Guantanamo Bay already has a pretty bad name, but not because of dinosaur sightings as you might think. Instead, it is known for things like violence and dictatorship. Over the years, many people, from people who live on the islands to US Marines, have said they saw the same kind of pterosaur-like creature. Some of these stories go all the way back to 1965, and even before that. This is because technology is getting better and people are traveling between the US and Cuba more often. There have been a lot more sightings than the public knows about. One pair of us soldiers who both still work for the Navy and would rather not be identified. People around Papua New Guinea in 1984 said they saw something that looked like a pterosaur, but they didn't say anything until much later in 2009. Both of them said that the pterodactyls shown in the Jurassic Park movies weren't too different from how they saw them. Even though the skin color and texture were the same, these creatures looked a little bit different. They were about as tall as a man and had a bill full of tiny sharp teeth, which is what you would expect from a predatory ocean bird. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that something like this can keep living in places where people don't go, like Papua New Guinea and many parts of Cuba. Even with all the technology we have today, they are good at hiding and staying out of sight. The good news is that they don't seem hostile and don't do anything aggressive. Maybe if you saw their babies, but that's normal for any animal, whether it's a bird, a dinosaur, or a mammal. I wouldn't really put these things in the same category as cryptids and other strange things. This seems like a situation similar to that of a sturgeon, which just needs to live in the right conditions to stay alive for all these years. However, sturgeon are much better known because people fish and find them all the time. It's much easier to see what's at the bottom of lakes and rivers than it is to see what's on the top of New Guinea or deep in the jungles of Cuba. It could be like an endangered species where there are only a few of them or a very small number of them. Again, there are a lot of locals and villagers who have heard all kinds of stories and seen these things for themselves. I haven't been able to find anything in a face-to-face encounter with one of these things, but that's because no one I know has been brave enough to travel to some of the altitudes where these things probably live. Existing might not be the right word, no matter how their nests and dens look. They are probably pretty high up, sitting on top of places that people could never get to. In 1965, Patty Carson and her brother were said to have seen a real pterosaur outside of the Guantanamo military base. This shows that there have been sightings before 1980, when two naval marines and a US Marine named S. Cancun said to have seen two large pterodactyls at the same Guantanamo military base. But he saw the person in 1971. But people don't just claim to have seen pterosaurs in Cuba and New Guinea. People have seen them all over the United States, along with what some people call thunderbirds, but I'm sure they're two different animals. People have said that thunderbirds look like big black birds or eagles, but a dinosaur is easy to spot. Pop culture and our society as a whole have given us a pretty good idea of what a dinosaur looks like, in my opinion, that one would be hard to get wrong. On July 18, 2012, an unknown person was driving down Highway 27 in Franklin, Georgia, with their two sons around 8:15 a.m. when they looked up and saw what they said was a flying dinosaur. Many other people who claim to be witnesses are not just people who tell stories or have nothing to do. These are real professionals like lawyers in California, college professors, former biology professors, scientists, and even the founder of a company that makes electronics. There have also been sightings in Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, and South Africa, in addition to the United States. Large flying creatures with no feathers have been seen a lot. This seems to be a pattern. This pretty much rules out the idea of a thunderbird, leaving only flying reptiles, which points to dinosaurs or pterosaurs. Now, it's hard to get good sightings because the idea of a pterosaur or pterodactyl is so rare, and we think these animals went extinct a long time ago. It's much harder to understand than Bigfoot or anything else. Even big sea monsters are easier to understand. Something in the sky makes it hard to believe, because if there is a witness, well, there's really nowhere to hide. Something flying in the sky that no one has ever seen is very vulnerable and open to all kinds of sighting. Even though most of the eyewitness reports come from adults, there are quite a few from children who wouldn't even know what a pterosaur is or how to describe one. So how is it that they can give an exact description of a pterosaur when they have never even heard of one? As a skeptic, you really have to go back to the drawing board after seeing something like that. I mean, take silicon, which was thought to be extinct for a long time until it was found to be alive again in 1938. Remember that all it takes is one living fossil or specimen. Underwater specimens are a little easier to get, since underwater exploration technology has improved a lot in the past 100 years. But there's no doubt that one of these days, someone will catch one of these things. Someone will catch one of these things on film with how good D-slister cameras are getting. Yes, it was bound to happen at some point. Phone cameras. The real question is, if these things are making themselves known to the public, even in small ways, where are they nesting? It can't be on top of a cell phone tower or a telephone pole. It must be up high. There is no way to know how far these things can go. They might even dig holes in the ground and make nests there. But once more, no one has a living species to know for sure, trying to find out some things. I found an anonymous report from a person who says they saw one of these pterosaurs when they were 12 years old. This person is 67 years old. In Ontario, Canada, around 1960 and 1961, here's what happened. It was a dull, rainy morning in the fall. The rain had just stopped, so we kids were forced to go outside during our morning recess. It was cold and wet, and a low-hanging fog hovered about 20 aft above ground. US guys started a ball game but quickly gave up because the ball kept disappearing into the overhead fog. So we decided to quit and just wait for the bell. Suddenly we heard screams. We looked up to feel that the girls and the ones farthest away from us were pointing into the overhead fog bank and screaming. Then the girls below them began screaming and pointing into the fog. I was curious, as were all the other boys. So we positioned ourselves under the fog, hoping we would get to see whatever it was they were screaming at. I can still remember me bracing my legs apart so as to not lose my balance as I looked up into a great cloud. Suddenly, it appeared an airplane-sized blackbird was silently gliding just at the bottom of the fog bank. It must have been that low so we could see where it was going by, looking at the ground. It appeared to be maybe 20 aft over my head, and I could see it clear as a bell. The first thing I noticed was obviously its size. I was directly under one wing, and it was much wider than myself and a group of my buddies put together. I would estimate one wing to be 20 ft in length. Then I noticed a good 3 ft long pointed beak and a shorter-to-footage bump on the back of its head, which was not pointed as if it was a beak. Usually when people report anonymous sightings like this, there is very little to gain. So the incentive to cultivate a fictionist story is minimal, while revisiting the idea that these so-called pterosaurs are mainly not hostile or aggressive. There have been reports of so-called large flying creatures killing people on the mainland of Papua New Guinea and villages around cities, and adult humans even being carried away. Although news like that rarely, if ever, finds its way over to the Western world, especially dealing with crypt of that nature. One quick thing I wanted to point out before I ended this email to you, and it almost seems like we coddle a revered flying god. Illustrated in many of the ancient Aztec and Mayan cultures, although commonly depicted with feathers, it's very possible that it could have very well been depicted from a pterosaur of some kind, considering back in those days they lived in total desolate jungles with high probability of all sorts of other creatures that flew around and lived in that time, back in a time where much of the jungles and surrounding areas were long forgotten about.